Welcome back to another deep dive. Today, we are opening up a file that I think is, well, it's arguably one of the most misunderstood in American political history.
I'd agree with that.
If you lived through the 1980s, you lived through this. If
Yeah.
you've studied history, even casually, you've seen the photos.
Yeah.
We are talking about Nancy Reagan.
Nancy Reagan, a figure who is somehow both incredibly visible. I mean, you can probably picture that specific shade of red dress right now.
Oh, absolutely.
And yet, for a long time, she remained, totally opaque to the public.
Exactly. I feel like culturally we have these two cardboard cutouts of her, and they just don't seem to fit together.
Right.
On one side, you have the adoring wife. You know the look, it actually has a name. The gaze.
The gaze, yes.
Staring up at Ronald Reagan like he's the only person in the universe,
Yeah,
totally submissive, just happy to be there.
Right, the devoted helpmate. The traditionalist who just wanted to bake cookies, though she probably didn't actually bake them herself.
Probably not, no.
And support her man. That was the image she projected.
And then on the other side, you have the caricature that the media and her critics built. Queen Nancy, the woman with the $200,000 chana, the designer gowns, the just say no finger wagging, and the woman who supposedly ran the White House with an iron fist.
I mean, the astrologer.
Okay.
We can never, ever forget the astrologer.
How could we? I mean, that is the plot twist to end all plot twists.
It really is.
But here's the thing. When we actually went through the stack of biographies, the memoirs from staff, the declassified schedules, those caricatures just fall apart.
They do.
Or at least they turn out to be masks for something much more interesting and much more complex.
What you find when you dig into the archives is that she wasn't just a wife and she wasn't just a socialite. She was, in many practical ways, a co-president. And I don't use that term lightly.
It is a heavy term.
Yeah.
But looking at the evidence firing chiefs of staff, dictating the president's schedule down to the minute, reshaping foreign policy toward the Soviet Union, I mean, it's hard to argue against it.
Exactly. So that is our mission for this deep dive. We want to move past the caricature and really unpack the psychology of Nancy Reagan.
Right.
We're talking about a woman driven by a fierce, almost terrifying need for security and control, and we need to understand how that specific psychological need shaped the American presidency in the 1980s.
To understand that, though, we can't start in the White House. We can't even start in Hollywood. We have to go back to a very unstable childhood that, well, it effectively created the Nancy Reagan we know. Because she wasn't born into power.
No, not at all. And this is the part that usually surprises people who only know the Queen Nancy era. She was born Anne Frances Robbins in New York City, July 6, 1921. Though in classic Hollywood style, she often told people she was born in 1923.
A little resume editing right from the start. I love it.
Exactly. Control the narrative from day one. But the key event here isn't the date. It's the family dynamic. Her father, Ken Robbins, was a used car salesman, and her mother, Edith Luckett, was an actress. They split up pretty much immediately after she was born.
And the father.
He just removed himself from the picture. Vanished.
So abandonment number one.
Right. But then comes the second, perhaps more significant blow. Her mother, Edith, is a working actress in the 1920s. That doesn't mean glamorous trailers and movie sets. That means the vaudeville circuit. That means touring, the road.
It's a grind.
It's a grind, and you can't take a toddler on the road in those conditions. So for 6 years, Nancy, or Anne, as she was technically named, is left with an aunt in Bethesda, Maryland.
That's a long time for a child to be separated from their mother.
All right.
Especially in those developmental years. We're talking ages 2 to 7 or 8.
Exactly. It's an eternity in kid time. She would travel to New York occasionally to see her mother on stage, and she talks about watching her from the wings.
Wow.
There's this really poignant image she describes in her memoirs of watching her mother putting on makeup, transforming into someone else. And little Nancy would pretend to be an actress herself.
Of course.
She was emulating the mother she couldn't live with.
It sounds like she was trying to become the person her mother would want to be with. Or maybe trying to speak her language.
Or trying to enter her mother's world the only way she knew how. You know, historians and psychologists who have analyzed her life point to this unstable environment as the root of her lifelong craving for security.
It makes sense.
She learned early on that people leave, that security is fragile, and that you have to work very hard, you have to perform effectively to keep the people you love close to you.
But then her fortune changes. I mean, dramatically. It's like a plot twist in a movie where the orphan suddenly finds out they're royalty.
It really is. In 1929, her mother remarries, and not just to anyone. She marries Loyal Davis, a very wealthy, very prominent neurosurgeon in Chicago.
Talk about a status upgrade.
Massive. They move to Chicago, and suddenly Nancy isn't the Onandan kid in Maryland anymore. She's living in high society. She's attending the girls' Latin school. She's living in a luxury apartment on Lakeshore Drive.
Yeah, and she gets a new father figure?
Loyal Davis. And the name Loyal is almost too perfect, isn't it?
A little on the nose.
He was a man of extreme discipline, arch-conservative values, and rigidity. He was the establishment. And Nancy didn't rebel against him. She worshipped him.
She wanted to be his daughter.
Desperately. At age 14, Loyal Davis formally adopts her. She becomes Nancy Davis. She effectively erases Anne Frances Robbins.
A completely new identity.
She gains the security, the status, and the ideology that would define the rest of her life.
It's fascinating because usually when a step-parent comes in with strict rules, the teenager rebels. But she leaned in.
She leaned in because he offered safety. He offered a world that wasn't going to disappear. And he imprinted his conservative political views on her very, very deeply.
It's interesting, though, because she still had that connection to the acting world through her mother. I read that her godmother was Alla Nazimova.
Which is a huge deal. Alla Nazimova was a legend of the silent film era. She was eccentric, she was famous, she was wealthy, and because of her mother's connections, young Nancy is hanging out with people like Spencer Tracy and Walter Houston.
So it wasn't just a fantasy.
It wasn't just a fantasy, it was her social circle. She was straddling these two worlds, the rigid, conservative wealth of Chicago and the glamorous, artistic chaos of the theater elite.
So it makes sense that she heads to Hollywood. She goes to Smith College first, studies drama, and then heads west. But she wasn't exactly a superstar, was she?
She was. Solid. She signed with MGM in 1949. But if you look at her filmography, she was almost immediately typecast. She played the loyal wife and mother.
Which is foreshadowing at its finest.
It really is. She was in movies like The Next Voice You Hear, where she plays a pregnant housewife who hears God on the radio. It's very wholesome, very 1950s.
Right.
Or Donovan's Brain, which is this sci-fi B-movie where she plays the baffled wife of a scientist whose body is being possessed by a disembodied brain in a tank.
Baffled wife seems to be the lane Hollywood picked for her.
She was the reactor, never the actor, if you know what I mean. Critics were actually kind. The New York Times called her delightful and convincing. But she wasn't setting the world on fire.
She wasn't Marilyn Monroe.
Not at all. She famously said later, "I was never really a career woman, but became one only because I hadn't found the man I wanted to marry."
That brings us to the meet cute, or maybe the meet scheme, depending on how cynical you want to be.
This is one of the great debates among biographers. So it's 1949, the Red Scare is heating up in Hollywood, the blacklist is real.
Very real.
Nancy Davis sees her name on a list of communist sympathizers in a Hollywood trade paper.
Which would be a career killer.
Yeah.
Even for a solid actress.
Absolutely. Now, it turns out it was a different Nancy Davis, common name, but she is frantic. So who does she call to clear her name?
The president of the Screen Actors Guild.
Ronald Reagan.
Of course.
She asks for a meeting to get this cleared up. They meet for dinner. He explains it's a mistake. The guild will protect her. He'll take care of it. And the rest is history.
But I feel a but coming.
But some biographers argue she knew exactly what she was doing. She was the daughter of Loyal Davis. She was well-connected. She could have fixed a clerical error regarding her name without a personal dinner meeting with the president of the guild. The suspicion is that she used this scare as a pretext to get in a room with him.
She saw her target.
Ronald Reagan was handsome, he was charming, and he was a leader. He was the ultimate security object. She later said, "My life began with Ronnie." And I think she meant that quite literally. She felt like a half person until she found him.
So they get married in 1952. And this detail stuck out to me. The wedding had only 2 guests.
William Holden and Brenda Marshall, that's it.
That's it.
No family, no big reception.
That feels incredibly isolated for 2 Hollywood actors who know everyone.
It sets the tone for their entire life. It was an exclusive club of 2. They were notoriously insular. They didn't really need other people. They didn't have a wide circle of intimate friends who were let inside. It was Nancy and Ronnie against the world.
They were total opposites, though. How did that dynamic work?
On the surface, yes. Ronald was the eternal optimist. He was sunny. He believed things would just work out. He was the guy who could sleep soundly before a big speech. Nancy was the worrier. She was the pessimist. She was the one anticipating the disaster.
She did the worrying so he didn't have to.
Exactly. They completed each other. He could float because she was holding the string, checking for storm clouds, but that puts a tremendous burden on her. If he is the good cop of his own life, she has to be the bad cop.
And that intensity, that us against the world vibe, that had to have fallout. And the fallout usually lands on the kids.
It was very difficult for the children. You have to remember the structure. You have Michael and Maureen, Ronald's kids, with Jane Wyman, his first wife.
Right.
And then Nancy and Ronald have Patty and Ron. The relationship there was strained, is putting it mildly.
Patty Davis, in particular, seems to have been a lightning rod.
Patty was the rebel. She completely rejected their conservatism. In the 60s and 70s, she went full counterculture.
I read she lived with the Eagles for a while.
She did. She joined the nuclear freeze movement, which was explicitly protesting her father's policies. She wrote books that were very critical of her parents, portraying Nancy as cold and controlling.
For long periods, Nancy was estranged from her children.
It feeds into that Queen Nancy narrative later that she was cold, but inside the marriage, it was warm. They were famously affectionate. He called her Mommy. She called him Ronnie.
Mommy, great.
It was a closed lineage of affection that didn't always extend to the next generation. They were so focused on each other, the kids often felt like interruptions.
So Ronald moves from acting to politics.
Yeah.
And Nancy becomes the First Lady of California in 1967. Was she ready for that?
She was reluctant. She didn't love the campaigning. She didn't like sharing him. But once she was in, she was fierce. And this is where we see the first flashes of the controversy that would follow her to Washington.
The house, right.
The governor's mansion in Sacramento. It was an old Victorian house. Nancy took one look at it and basically said, no way.
Not happened.
She called it a fire hazard, said it wasn't fit for a family, so they moved to a wealthy suburb instead.
Which I'm sure went over great with the taxpayers.
Critics called her snobbish. It reinforced this idea that she was too good for the people's house. It was the first time the public started to see her as high maintenance.
And then came the press. In 1968, Joan Didion, one of the sharpest writers of the century, wrote a piece called Pretty Nancy.
Ooh, that sounds like a compliment, but knowing Joan Didion...
It's loaded.
It was definitely not a compliment. Didion spent a day with Nancy and wrote this scathing profile. She portrayed Nancy as artificial, out of touch, basically a plastic doll with a frozen smile.
Wow.
She described Nancy plucking imaginary lint off her dress while talking about the poor. That label, artificial, stuck. And it hurt Nancy deeply. It made her incredibly defensive through the media, a grudge she carried all the way to the White House.
Let's jump to that transition. The 1980 election, Reagan wins. They arrive in Washington in 1981, and the vibe change from the Carters to the Reagans was significant.
Whiplash, absolute whiplash. Jimmy Carter was the guy carrying his own luggage, turning down the thermostat in the White House, wearing cardigans to save energy.
The malaise era.
The mood was austerity. The Reagans wanted to bring back the glamour. They were thinking Kennedy-esque Camelot, but the timing was terrible.
Because the economy was in the tank.
A deep recession. People were losing jobs. Interest rates were sky high, and here comes Nancy arriving in town, deciding the White House is in disrepair, which, to be fair to her, it actually was, and launching a massive renovation.
And then, the China.
Oh, the China. This is the stuff of PR nightmares. It is taught in crisis management classes on what not to do. She ordered a new state China service from Lenox, 4,370 pieces, red with etched gold bands.
And the price tag.
$209,508.
Over $200,000 for plates. In 1981 money.
Now here's the nuance. This was paid for by private donations. It wasn't tax dollars.
Okay, that's an important distinction.
The Knapp Foundation paid for it.
Yeah.
But the optics, absolute disaster. Because at the exact same time this news breaks, the Reagan administration is proposing budget cuts to school lunches.
Oh, right. This is the infamous ketchup is a vegetable moment.
Exactly. The administration proposed classifying ketchup and pickle relish as vegetables to save money on school lunch requirements. So the media juxtaposes these two things. Nancy's $200,000 gold-rimmed china versus classifying ketchup as a vegetable for poor kids.
That's brutal.
It solidified the Queen Nancy nickname. She was seen as Marie Antoinette.
And the clothes didn't help.
No, she loved fashion. Reagan red became her signature color. She wore Galanos, Bill Blass, Oscar de la Renta. The problem was she wasn't just buying them, she was borrowing them.
And borrowing is in heavy air quotes here.
Heavy air quotes. She would accept thousands of dollars in designer gowns. She claimed they were loans to promote American fashion and that she would return them. But often she didn't, or she kept them for a long time without disclosing them.
And that's not legal.
And that violated the Ethics in Government Act.
Did she ever get caught?
She did. Years later, after they left the White House, the IRS and ethics committees investigated. The Reagans ended up having to pay back taxes and interest on something like $3 million worth of fashion items and gifts that hadn't been reported properly.
Wow. That is staggering.
But she was savvy. She knew she was bleeding public support. So in 1982, she goes to the Gridiron Dinner, which is this annual press roast, usually pretty stuffy.
Right.
Nancy comes out on stage dressed as a bag lady.
Wait, really? The First Lady?
Yes. She's wearing mismatched clothes, feathers, rain boots. She looks ridiculous. And she sings a parody song called Secondhand Clothes to the tune of Secondhand Rose. And at the end, she smashed a plate on stage.
That is bold.
It was brilliant. She proved she could take a joke. She proved she wasn't this humorless ice queen. The press loved it. It bought her a huge amount of goodwill. It was a masterclass in changing the narrative.
So she's navigating this PR minefield, trying to fix her image. But then, just a few months into the presidency, everything changes. March 30th, 1981.
The assassination attempt. We cannot overstate how this event rewired Nancy Reagan's brain.
She gets to the hospital, George Washington University Hospital, and she sees him.
She said later, "I had never seen a face like that with my husband in it. It was chaos. Reagan was gray. He was struggling to breathe. He had a bullet in his lung. And yet, famously, he looked at her and cracked a joke. He told her, 'Honey, I forgot to duck.'"
Which is the ultimate Reagan optimist moment. Even on death's door, he's the performer.
Right. But for Nancy, the pessimist, the worrier, this was the apocalypse. This was her worst nightmare coming true.
The one thing she feared most.
The one thing she was supposed to do, keep him safe, had failed. She lost 12 pounds in weeks. She started sleeping with one of his shirts because the smell comforted her. She was absolutely terrified every time he left the White House.
And this is where she pivots from socialite First Lady to the protector.
She decided her primary job, above policy, above parties, above everything else, was to keep him alive. And if the Secret Service couldn't guarantee it, she needed something else. She needed an edge.
Enter the astrologer.
Enter Joan Quigley.
Now, I think a lot of people hear astrology and they think she checked her horoscope in the newspaper over coffee. But this wasn't that.
No, this was an operational dependency. Nancy had dabbled in astrology before, like many in Hollywood. But after the shooting, Merv Griffin, the TV host, told Nancy that Joan Quigley had actually predicted that March 30th would be a dangerous day for the president.
Oh, that is the worst possible thing she could have heard.
Yeah.
It validates the fear. It tells her this could have been prevented.
Completely. Nancy believes Quigley has the answers. She hires her. Quigley is on a retainer, $3,000 a month paid through a private fund, and she starts dictating the President of the United States schedule.
How deep did this go? Was it just avoid Tuesdays?
It was incredibly granular. Quigley would provide color-coded calendars. Green for good days, red for bad days, yellow for be careful.
No.
This determined when Air Force One took off. It determined when he gave speeches. It determined the timing of cancer surgery. It even determined the timing of the Geneva summit with Gorbachev.
The scheduling of the Cold War was determined by the alignment of the planets.
Effectively, yes. If Quigley said, "Don't travel on the 14th," the president didn't travel on the 14th.
And this was a state secret.
Strictly. Nancy knew how it would look. She knew the public would think they were crazy, so they kept it totally under wraps.
Well, someone had to know. The staff had to know.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just move the president's schedule without telling the chief of staff.
The staff knew, and it drove them crazy. Specifically, Ronald Reagan, the chief of staff.
This brings us to the power behind the throne section. Because this wasn't just about stars, it was about access.
Ronald Reagan was a powerful man, a former CEO of Merrill Lynch. He was a master of the universe type. He liked order, he liked hierarchy, and suddenly he's trying to schedule a press conference and Nancy is saying, "No, Ronnie can't go out on Tuesday, the stars aren't right," or "His void of moon is in the wrong place."
That lead to a clash.
It was a war. Ronald Reagan resented her involvement. He saw her as a meddler. He called her the Dragoon. Nancy saw him as a liability who wasn't protecting her husband enough, especially when the Iran-Contra scandal broke.
Ah, okay.
She felt Reagan was arrogant and was letting Ronnie take the fall for the arms for hostages deal.
So how does this end?
It ends with a phone call. They are arguing about the schedule. Nancy is demanding he resign. The conversation gets heated. Ronald Reagan, in a moment of frustration, makes the fatal mistake of hanging up on the First Lady.
You do not hang up on Nancy Reagan.
You do not. When the president heard about it, he was furious. He felt it was a deep disrespect to his wife. He fired Reagan shortly after. This cemented the idea that Nancy was the associate president. If you crossed her, you were gone. She had already helped push out campaign manager John Sears back in 1980. She pushed out national security advisors. She was the HR department of the White House.
But she also used that influence on policy.
Yeah.
Particularly regarding the Soviet Union.
This is her most significant political legacy. She knew that history would judge Ronald Reagan on whether he was a warmonger or a peacemaker. The hardliners in the administration, the hawks, wanted to keep the pressure on the evil empire. They didn't want to talk. Nancy wanted him to talk to Gorbachev.
She was the dove.
She was the pragmatic dove. She pushed him to soften his rhetoric. She allied herself with George Shultz, the Secretary of State. She believed that a personal relationship with Gorbachev could end the Cold War. She whispered in Ronnie's ear constantly, "Do it for your legacy. Be the peacemaker."
Which brings us to the other relationship in that equation. Nancy and Arisa Gorbacheva.
The First Lady Wars. These two did not get along. Releza was the wife of Mikhail Gorbachev. She was an intellectual, a lecturer on Marxism-Leninism. She was sharp, opinionated, and she did not defer to Nancy.
She didn't play the adoring wife role.
No. She would come to the U.S. and lecture Nancy on the failings of the American system, on the superiority of socialism, on history, on architecture.
And Nancy probably didn't love being lectured.
Nancy reportedly asked her staff, "Who does that dame think she is?" She found Reza tedious and preachy, but, and this is credit to her discipline, she sucked it up. She orchestrated the social side of the summits perfectly.
Let me give an example.
There's a famous moment at the Washington summit. Nancy invited Van Cliburn, the pianist. Now, Van Cliburn was an American, but he was a hero in Russia because he had won the Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow years earlier.
A cultural bridge.
A huge one. Nancy asks him to play Moscow Nights.
A Russian classic.
And as he plays, the Gorbachevs start singing along. Ronald Reagan starts humming. The tension in the room just evaporated. George Shultz said later you could feel the ice crumbling. Wow. Nancy weaponized the dinner party for the sake of détente. She played the hostess role, but with a strategic geopolitical endgame.
While she's doing all this behind-the-scenes firing staff, managing the Cold War, she needs a public platform. Every first lady needs a cause, and Nancy's was big.
Massive. Just say no.
Where did that phrase actually come from? It sounds like a Madison Avenue marketing slogan.
It was spontaneous, actually. She was visiting a school in Oakland in 1982. A little girl raised her hand and asked, "Mrs. Reagan, what do I do if someone offers me drugs?" And Nancy just said, "Just say no."
And it caught fire.
It became the catchphrase of the decade. She traveled 250,000 miles. She appeared on different strokes. She hosted conferences with first ladies from around the world. It was a cultural phenomenon.
But looking back, it gets a lot of criticism.
It does. It's viewed by many experts today as overly simplistic. It treated drug addiction as a failure of willpower rather than a complex medical or social issue.
Right.
Critics argued it ignored the root causes: poverty, unemployment, the systemic issues driving the crack epidemic that was devastating cities at the time. It was a slogan, not a solution. It felt like a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
And then there is the silence, the other epidemic of the 80s, AIDS.
This is the shadow over her legacy. The AIDS epidemic exploded during the Reagan presidency. Thousands of people were dying, and the administration was largely silent for years.
And this was personal for them, right?
Yeah.
They came from Hollywood. They had friends in that community.
They did. Rock Hudson, a close friend and Hollywood giant, died of AIDS. When he was dying in Paris, he reached out to the White House for help getting into a hospital, and the response was cool.
That's rough.
The criticism, and it is heavy, is that Nancy, who had the president's ear, didn't push him to speak out publicly until it was too late.
Does the historical record show any movement from her on this?
There are reports that privately she urged him to address it. She knew it was a disaster, but publicly she held the party line. She didn't want to alienate the conservative base.
So it was political.
The contrast between her hypervisibility on drugs and her invisibility on AIDS is something historians still critique her for heavily. It remains a major point of contention.
So the Reagans leave the White House in 1989. They go back to Bel Air. But the story doesn't end there.
No. And in some ways, her most humanizing chapter happens after the power is gone.
First, there was her own health scare.
Right. In 1987, actually, while still in office, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She chose to have a mastectomy. And that was a controversial decision at the time. Some people thought it was too drastic compared to a lumpectomy. There was actually a bizarre backlash where critics said she was setting women back by not fighting to keep the breast.
It seems incredibly unfair. It's a medical decision.
It was. But the Nancy effect was real. Mammogram rates across the country spiked. She saved lives by being public about it.
But then comes a real tragedy.
Yeah.
1994. Ronald Reagan writes that famous handwritten letter to the American people announcing he has Alzheimer's.
The long goodbye. For a decade, Nancy Reagan went from being the glamorous first lady to the primary caregiver. And this wasn't just managing care. She was there. She protected his dignity with the same ferocity she used to protect his safety.
She created a cocoon around him.
She did. She filtered visitors. She made sure no one saw him when he wasn't himself. She wanted the world to remember the robust president, not the man fading away.
And this changed how the public saw her.
Completely. The Dragon Lady image softened. People saw a woman who was losing the love of her life by inches, day by day. Her devotion was undeniable, it was tragic, and it was human.
And she made a surprising political move during this time.
She did. This is where the protector role overrode the conservative role. She came out in support of embryonic stem cell research,
Which was a huge issue at the time.
It was the hot-button issue of the early 2000s. The George W. Bush administration was against federal funding for it. The Republican Party was largely against it on religious and ethical grounds.
Oh.
But Nancy believed it could hold the cure for Alzheimer's.
So she broke with her party.
She broke with the party. She lobbied the White House. She publicly disagreed with George W. Bush. It showed that her loyalty was to Ronnie, not to a political platform. If she thought something could help him or help his legacy, she didn't care about the politics.
And then the funeral in 2004. I think everyone remembers the images.
She planned every detail, of course. She invited Margaret Thatcher. She invited Gorbachev. But the moment that defines her widowhood was at the very end.
At the casket.
She had held it together all week, the rigid composure she was famous for. But as she was leaving the casket at the burial site in Simi Valley, she broke. She leaned over, kissed the coffin, mouthed, "I love you," and she just collapsed into tears. It was raw. It was the moment the public finally understood the depth of that bond.
She lived for another 12 years after that.
She did. She reconciled with her children, Patty and Michael, which was a nice closing arc. She continued to protect the Reagan legacy until she died in 2016 at age 94.
So let's unpack the legacy. Where did she stand?
It's a fascinating trajectory. When she left the White House, her approval ratings were mixed. In 1993, Siena College polled historians, and she ranked nearly last among first ladies.
Ouch.
But recently, she's climbed up to around 15th place. As we get distance, historians are recognizing that, like her or not, she was effective, she was powerful, she was essential to the Reagan presidency.
It's the paradox of Nancy Reagan.
Exactly. She projected this 1950s housewife image. I'm just looking at Ronnie. But she wielded more raw political power than perhaps any first lady since Edith Wilson.
Which raises the big question for our listeners.
Right. We elect a president, one person. But the reality is they bring a partner. And that partner is unelected, unvetted, and has total access.
Nancy Reagan's primary motivation wasn't the Constitution or the party or the voters. It was the personal protection of her husband.
So the question is the role of protector-in-chief a necessary burden that we just accept? Or is it a constitutional loophole that gives immense power to someone we never voted for?
Something to chew on. Nancy Reagan, a complicated woman who loved a man, feared the world, and ran the White House to keep the two apart. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Always a pleasure.
And to our listeners, next time you see a first lady, look a little closer. There's always more going on behind the gaze. We'll see you next time.